think we might get started. Good evening, everyone. So this is our first budget for 2021-22, elected member workshop number 1. And I'd just like to welcome everyone here. I'd like to welcome anyone who's watching on YouTube. Welcome to our staff, our senior leadership team, finance team, Henrietta, our CEO, and will be led through this workshop by Paul Horde, who's our Manager for Finance and Corporate Services. Welcome, Paul. So firstly, I'd also like to acknowledge Councillor Davies, Councillor Kosh, Deputy Mayor Samble and Councillor Fraser, who are also here as part of this workshop. I'd like to acknowledge this land that we meet on tonight is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. So this workshop session has been convened, as I said, for the purpose of discussing issues that involve preliminary, said that wrong as well, preliminary 2021-22 budget and long-term financial plan discussions, and to brief council members and the community on issues relating to their decision-making function. This session is solely for the purpose of information sharing and not for the purpose of debating issues, building consensus position, or otherwise discharging council's deliberative and decision-making functions, because that sits within a committee or a council meeting forum. Members of our community, we don't have anyone here face-to-face this evening, so I don't think that's an issue. I would ask people to turn their mobile phones to silent, please, because I think that's a respectful thing to do. In a workshop, we don't have any set agenda and no minutes are taken. If there's an emergency, we'll be following Henrietta out. He's our leader, and we'll follow the exit signs and don't use the lifts, of course. Should there be any, I don't think there's any requirement, Paul, to go into confidence. I think this will be all in the public realm, so no issue there. So that's the housekeeping out of the way. Without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Mr. Horwood, and you can take us through our budget session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Karen. Members, this is the third budget of your current term, and the matters I'll be talking with you tonight will be very familiar, hopefully, and resonate with discussions that we've had in previous years, but nonetheless, I think they are important discussions to have to sort of set the overarching scene framework for upcoming discussions relative to budget, long-term plan and council's rating strategy. I've got on the slide there, I've given you all a hard copy of the handout presentation I'll be going through with you tonight. But essentially, the discussion topics, as I've got up there, is really just covering through some of the key highlights of our financial performance position to date. Then going through some various long-term financial plan model scenarios to talk through that. Just give an overview of our operating revenue and expenditure position and indicative forecasts, then turning discussion towards debt, and closing the workshop, Mayor, with activities that are currently underway to inform further workshops, and some sort of take-home messages for members, and importantly wanting to give the opportunity for members to ask any questions. Mayor, I'm hoping to sort of hopefully wrap up by about 8:30 discussion. Tony, if you then go to the next slide, please. So with the corporate management framework, as I've got on this slide, the purpose of putting this in was really just to emphasise the alignment and synergy between a lot of the key documents that the elected body considers. As you would clearly appreciate, the community plan is our overarching document, and underpinning that is a whole raft of documents. But certainly from my perspective, in my role, those key documents are the long-term financial plan, the long-term infrastructure and asset management plan, and the annual budget and business plan. Noting, members, that again, there has to be consistency between the documents, particularly between the asset management plan and the long-term financial plan. So in that context, members, what needs to occur is the indicative funding for asset management, whether it be replacement or renewal for existing assets, needs to be input into the long-term financial plan. So those two plans need to be in alignment, need to be talking the same dollars. So that to start with, the asset management plan needs to inform the long-term financial plan. And based on that, then the council needs to consider, well, is the indicative funding in the asset management plan sustainable from a long-term financial plan perspective? Also, as you can appreciate, one of the most important decisions the elected member body makes each year is the adoption of the annual budget. And I do want to stress that the consideration of the budget should not be done in isolation. And when I say that, that's in isolation from future financial years. So council needs to obviously consider the financial implications for the 21-22 financial year as part of its upcoming discussions, but the council needs to be mindful of what the future financial impacts will be. Then on the next slide, I just wanted to demonstrate here, members, I guess highlight the sort of myriad of elements that help inform the annual budget. And that can be driven by, again, the community plan and the goals and strategies contained therein, which will predominantly inform budget bids by way of capital budget bids, but also got the long-term financial plan, which in the context of the annual budget will establish the broad financial parameters around the budget discussions. So the long-term financial plan in that regard will suggest what an indicative operating result is likely to be based on key assumptions contained therein, and will also indicate what indicative capacity there will be for future capital works, being mindful of council's various policy positions relative to operating surplus and its net financial liabilities ratio. But just as importantly, members, the budget considerations need to take into account other factors as well, whether it be council resolutions during the year, ongoing consideration of service levels, COVID-19 and what that means in the context of the budget, also federal and state government decisions, legislation and upcoming elections in 2022, and also as well, not just necessarily financial factors, but there can be other, not just financial factors, there can be non-financial factors such as environmental factors to take into consideration as well. So it's really there just to demonstrate, yes, the myriad of elements that populate those discussions.
I'll take a question from Councillor Koch. He had his hand up while we finish that slide.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I'm just wondering, with the service levels, how do we review those service levels?
Yes, through you, Mayor Karen, that can be done at any time by the elected body, but we will essentially, with the information we'll be providing to you as part of upcoming workshops, particularly with their recurrent budget. That will sort of demonstrate where our costs are being incurred, what the costs of services are, and it's always certainly important that council turns its mind to service levels, service reviews, because it may be from year to year over time that council may wish to change its priorities and focus, putting more attention to certain services, and if that's the case, is it done with the consideration of cutback in other services? So that's always a conversation that can be certainly had as part of the budget discussions through workshops and special meetings.
Councillor Davies.
So is there any influence from the fact that we adopted the last budget months late? Did anything get shifted between budgets because of that?
No, in short, yes, there was no impact, well, certainly no material, tangible impact on the upcoming budget relating to that timing. Ideally, under our policy, I think it's our budget management policy, Mayor, we ideally look to adopt the budget before June 30. However, that's not necessarily always achievable. It's aspirational. And as you're aware, because of COVID, that was deferred to mid-August. And we're looking with the budget timetable, Mayor, this year for early July adoption. So in terms of the budget figures, financials, it doesn't really have any impact. It's just from a internal administration impact that there are a few flow-on consequences with a delayed adoption, primarily from the fact that the longer the budget's delayed, it means less time that staff have to, particularly from a capital works perspective, to turn their mind to bringing those capital projects to fruition. So yes, it's always best to get an early budget adoption.
Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Mayor Karen. Paul, I've been on about it before, about the point of when we as a council go out to the community. And the community plan that we've just adopted is certainly a hell of a lot of work being put into it, but not a lot of work from the community has come back to support you and the team in making future, suggestions, ideas or whatever. And then, of course, we were, delivered this virus thing. How important is it to get the community, and how do we do it better to get the community more involved with when that community plan comes to the floor, where we go out there and say, we want your ideas? Is there much support you get from that? I followed that very carefully, as I have with other things in at the present moment, with Erin and the new development along the Essex Park and all that sort of stuff. It's most important that people turn up on Saturday, if they haven't turned up before, to be able to give, Erin, the team, and then us as council to make that decision. So I'm just wondering, is there a better way that we can get the community to, open up their mouths and maybe give us some suggestions?
Yes, Deputy Mayor, look, as you would appreciate with your time on council, it's always been certainly a challenge to get community engagement, particularly relative to the budget. And as you'd realise, quite often we only get a handful of submissions, which is always disappointing. We'd like a lot more, but I know I thought a good sort of initiative in terms of last 12 months ago was the pre-budget engagement we undertook, which you might recall included the posters on the walls at the various sites and hard copy surveys that could be completed. Obviously, we'll go through the various workshops to develop a consultation document for the community, and we'll broadly consult that as we always do. But I don't know that there's terribly much more that we can do that we compared to what we've done in the past to get that engagement.
I think over the Christmas January break, we did Bunyip did a 2-page spread on what we're going to do this year, what our projects are, and that encompasses proposed and what encompasses projects that we've signed off on effectively. But what we could do is, and the Bunyip have said that they will support further 2-page spreads on different particular issues, so it might be an opportunity to do a 2-page spread, take the Bunyip up on their offer on what's proposed once we get a draft budget, what's proposed, and do a pictorial and do that same. And that, I think that because that 2-page spread went down really, really well. People really like that. I think it's a really easy way of saying, well, we're going to do this. There'll be a lot in it. Might be a good opportunity to say what's in and what's out. But that's just another way of, telling people what we're planning. They might get confused with, that's what we're going to do, but it's, this is what we come out with. What do you think? But it's good. It's probably a good idea to have a crack at that.
Last year with the consultation pre-budget, if I remember, we had, well, not really what you call a good response, but we did have a better response than we've normally had. Is there any suggestion that we will do that again this year?
Through you, Mayor, no, I wasn't proposing to do that this time around, mainly due to, in the ideal scenario, yes, I would have liked to be in a position to do it, but mainly as a consequence of COVID, indirectly with the delayed adoption of the budget, there has been flow-on consequences all along the line, to the extent that we really didn't have the organisational capacity to do that initiative again. But nonetheless, we'll consider it in future years, but always open to suggestions as to how we can get better engagement and better response, particularly on the budget, recognising that, being brutally honest, it's quite often not a sexy topic until people get their rate notice, and then we know all about it. But
I do love it.
But certainly always welcome comments, and I'd love nothing better than to get a lot of applications and submissions. I'll continue, Mayor, if
Yes, absolutely.
Questions. So on the next slide, Town of Gawler by the numbers. The purpose of this slide, members, is just to demonstrate what I'm calling the current state of play in financial setting, and hopefully some of these numbers might resonate with you. But in short, we have a $30 million operating budget, so a sizable budget. And for 2020-21, we're currently looking, per the first quarter budget review, of a deficit in the order of just under $1 million. Noting, as you recall, that is heavily influenced by Council's COVID-19 financial support initiatives. So with those factors removed, the deficit would be in the order of $561,000. We have a $300 million asset base, which is heavily informed by our approximately 200 kilometre road network, roads, footpaths, curbs, stormwater and the like, and a sizable buildings asset base as well. Our forecast planned debt, and I'll walk you through debt separately later in the presentation, but our forecast planned debt at the moment is 23.7 million as at the 30th of June. And on average, we have generally about $3 million worth of capital expenditure on the replacement renewal of our existing assets, which is an important undertaking so that we're maintaining our asset stock. We have annual growth in the order of 2%. So as we all know, we're one of the fastest growing councils in the state, which does have naturally revenue consequences, but what is often overlooked is the expenditure consequences that come with that growth. And our current budgeted allocation of staff across the organisation is 130 FTE. Tony, if you just go to the next one. Okay. Members, in terms of the financial modelling, I'll walk you through at a very high level at this stage. What I've done is what's called some sensitivity analysis relative to indicative increases in general rate revenue from existing ratepayers. So this doesn't include any new revenue from growth from new ratepayers. What the models I've plugged is 4 scenarios ranging from a 1.5% increase through to a 3% increase, noting that our current adopted long-term plan incorporates and is modelled on a 3% increase. I've also put in that slide, members, some independent indices relative to the local government price index. The most recent reading of that, as it's September 2020, was actually a minus 0.3%, whereas the consumer price index, the recent reading that's come out this week for December, is at 1%.
Paul? Yep. Paul?
I always thought that the local government price index was higher than the CPI. Is it flipped?
It's flipped. It's flipped. Yeah. It is actually, yeah. And what's the local government index based on?
Through you, Mayor Karen, that's I guess a relevant point that in a local government setting, the CPI doesn't really have too much materiality. Hence why we have the local government price index, which is informed by costs specifically incurred by local government. So whether that be road materials, EB, increments and the like. So whereas a CPI is a household basket of goods, essentially purchased often at a supermarket. So the relevance between the two is poles apart, which was the reason why the local government price index came in when it did quite some years ago. But Councillor Kosh is right. Generally, there has been the LGPI has been a bit higher than the CPI, but obviously there's been factors that implementing it that has turned on its head just with these recent readings. On the next slide, members, I thought it might be appropriate to just give you a bit of an outline in terms of what some other councils have got in their long-term financial plans relative to future general rate increases. And you'll see from that slide that there's no right or wrong answer. There's an interesting mix ranging from your 2% essentially, noting that like Mount Barker are saying 1% above CPI. So for example, if CPI is currently 1%, you'd be assuming that would be translating to a 2% increase for them. So I just thought that was sort of an interesting insight. I have put a asterisk against Light Regional, who are indicating no more than 2.5%. And I guess an interesting reflection from the rating approach they have used in recent years. They have indicated with their budget commentary that they haven't changed their rate in the dollar for 3 years, which part of their marketing in that regard, Mayor, was they were freezing the rate in the dollar, which for all intents and purposes to the average ratepayer suggests that their rates weren't increasing. However, as you hopefully can appreciate, through the rating decisions you adopt each year, what an individual ratepayer pays and rates is informed by not only the rate in the dollar applied by council, but also the property valuation. So what's happened, and it's information in their public document, their budget document, and indicates that yes, they froze the rate in the dollar, but their property valuations increased on average 3.83%. So that automatically means, all else being equal, their general rate revenue went up from existing ratepayers by that amount. So, yes.
3.83, nearly 4%
Yes.
rate rise.
Yeah. Now, members,
Not
the
Not bad if you can get it.
yeah, well, it's an interesting approach, because it's certainly not one that I've ever advocated, because the approach I've always used is and this is essentially
You
mandated.
use the transparent approach, Mr.
Yes.
Ward. Yeah.
Well, under the legislation, Mayor, it's a two-stage approach. You have to adopt the budget, then you have to adopt the rates to generate the revenue required in the budget. And so, for example, my perspective is that if the budget mandates that the general rate revenue has to increase from existing ratepayers, for example, by 2%, but the property valuations for example, have gone up by 5%, well, to me, that means you have to actually reduce the rate in the dollar to compensate to achieve that target.
That's right.
So, yeah, you just need to be, they're the sort of, that's how the rates are normally calculated. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
But nonetheless, that's just provided for some sort of background context in terms of the approach from other councils. In the next slides we're going through, I'll show you graphically what those four scenarios, all else being equal, have on the indicative future operating results and our liabilities ratio. So you'll see on the first graph on the screen with the operating result is that based on those four scenarios of a 1 and 1.5 increase to 3%, naturally straight away you'll see with a 3% increase, it comes as no surprise, again, all else being equal in the budget, that council will be able to return to an operating surplus sooner with a 3% increase than a 1.5% increase, for example. And this is purely just done to demonstrate the impact of those different scenarios on council's financial indicators. Then, Tony, if you go to the next slide, with the operating ratio is essentially looking at those same dollars, but it's just reporting it in the operating ratio result, which measures the operating result as a percentage of total revenue. And council's policy position is that target is ideally between 0 to 10%. Bearing in mind, as you're aware, we are in a deficit position at the moment, looking to hopefully return to operating surplus across the next number of years. Then on the next slide with the net financial liabilities ratio, and as I mentioned before, Mayor, I'll talk about debt in due course, but it's important that council really doesn't just focus solely on debt. It needs to look at its overarching net financial liabilities, and what that means is looking not only just at debt, but council's total liabilities, and also take into consideration its net financial assets. So again, with these different four scenarios, you'll find that with a 1.5% increase, which is the blue line, you'll see straight away the immediate consequence of that. Again, all other factors remaining equal, that the ratio will remain higher because there'll be less revenue coming in to essentially reduce debt.
Oh, sorry, Paul, I was looking at the graph.
Yeah, just looking at that
Financial liabilities?
liabilities, are we actually at 100%? So we're 23 million as of the 30th of the 6th. Are you saying that we've got another $7 million of other liabilities like long service leave, et cetera, et cetera? Is that what it's saying? Are we at 100% at the moment?
What's that financial liabilities?
Yep. Yeah. Yes. That's showing is from a balance sheet perspective. It's looking at your total liabilities, which is your debt, your employee long service leave, annual leave, etc., and then deducting off that, off your total liabilities, essentially your financial assets, which is cash and or investments and debtors. So what you'll see in there is, yes, we're not I know because of the size of the graph, it's a bit constrained. No. However, it's important to emphasise that depending, and you'll see it on the next slide, that yes, for 2000 the current financial year, we are estimating to get very close to that threshold. But what just go back, sorry, one slide, Tony. What that graph and the next slide indicates is that with just for example, a 1.5% increase, then council would be clearly going way over that ratio threshold. Again, all else being equal, because that's informed by, well, how much capital expenditure are we doing, for example. So, Tony, if you then just jump to that slide here. So what I've put in this slide, members, is if you look at green, good, red is bad, so to speak, relative to our policy targets. And this, so what I'm demonstrating there, for example, is with the first set of data with the operating result, what that's showing is that in all of the scenarios, we are obviously in a deficit position at the moment, but what that indicates on the model and the key assumptions contained therein is that with a 1.5% increase, we'll be in deficit for the whole 10 years, and we wouldn't come out of deficit for an extended period after that. So it's to demonstrate, well, what's likely to be the indicative future financial impact on those key scenarios. Now, it also comes as no surprise that if you increase the revenue percentage increase, then you'll be coming back into surplus more quickly. So hence why with a 3% increase, again, emphasise with everything else in the model being the same, we would be indicatively back to an operating surplus by 2025.
So I'll just take a couple of questions. But
Yes.
I think I'll just go to Councillor. I think he had his hand up first, so I'll let Cody go first.
So is there any particular reason why our financial liabilities ratio would start jumping up again in 2028, 2029?
That would be because theoretically a major project. Is that right, Paul? Yeah. Paul?
Yes, the Councillor Kosh is right on the money. So what you might recall, and I can certainly vividly recall a special council meeting late March last year where we were essentially pretty much gearing up to, or come very close to endorse for consultation a long-term plan budget predicated on $2 million debt reduction in 2021, 21, 22. Then this thing called COVID hit, threw that out the door. But what I've continued in this model, members, is that back then I was demonstrating, well, if we were to get debt down over the next 4 to 5 years, for example, what would be the financial capacity to do the next iconic project. And I've still encapsulated that in the model, and that would be likely to occur, as Councillor Kosh has rightly pointed out, roughly in about 2027-28, which then sort of triggers because of the increased debt, that then the immediate flow on because of the major capital works undertaken would be you'd have the immediate consequence of new depreciation, new maintenance of that iconic asset. So I guess it's trying to demonstrate for members that what sort of approach you may need to consider taking over coming years if you want to develop, for want of a better word, a war chest such that you can afford to do that next iconic project, whatever that project is.
Paul?
Thanks. I just want to clarify, with this, it's only because of the scale it looks like it's 100%. Is that the only reason? Yeah, okay, that's all right. Because when we look at that...
It says 97 there. If you look on the green at the bottom,
your
financial indicators, so then that tells you exactly what
it
it is.
Yeah. So don't look closely
It's
at
still
this.
pretty close, 97.
Because 100% is our top of the policy, but it's 97%, but pretty close there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Paul Horde?
Yeah, and I think, members, it's important to, and I've said this in previous iterations of these discussions, that I believe it's important to have some sort of debt borrowing capacity contingency. And in that aspect, what always resonates with me, Mayor and members, is that you might recall, I think back in 2016, had those major flooding event, and there was financial consequences from that, which we had to immediately take on board. So I think it is important to have some sort of contingency in council's budget, but nonetheless recognising that, yes, we are a growth council, and it comes with challenges with relating to desire, expectation, need for capital projects. We're not like a metropolitan council with no growth. We've got major things happening, and there is financial consequences from that. If I then turn your minds, members, to the operating revenue and or the operating result, but I'll touch on the revenue elements first. Again, just showing here currently the state of play from an operating revenue perspective, and consistent with pretty much every other council in the state, there is, as you'd appreciate, a huge reliance on general rates to fund our budget. And for us and for a lot of councils, it's often in the range of between 70 to 80%. So the fact that ours is currently at 78% is no cause for concern, because that's pretty much the industry average. Obviously, other parts of the budget from a revenue perspective are comprised of statutory and user charges, whether it be development fees, fees for hire of facilities, use of the pool, etc. As you can appreciate, we're always advocating for grants, supports. Now, recognising, just important to reference here, the grant subsidies and contributions of referencing a 3.66, that does not include grants provided specifically for capital projects. They are treated separately as capital revenue, which doesn't come into the operating result. And the other revenue in the order of 400,000, which is only 2% of our budget, is pretty much sundry revenue, not elsewhere encapsulated in those above lines. On the next graph, what I've included here for the first time, members, is I thought this might be of interest to you. Getting a bit of a trend data, but looking back 5 years and looking forward 5 years. Now, in terms of forward looking, that's predicated on a 3% increase in rates from existing ratepayers. But you'll see there has generally been a sort of consistency trend clearly indicating that, again, the high reliance on general rate revenue. It is also important to consider, members, with regards to user charges. Another important decision council has to make each year is setting its fees and charges. And a question in that space is, well, what is the right fee to charge for a service? Noting that it's really only our cemetery operations that operate on full cost recovery. Pretty much every other service that we provide that has a user charge attached to it is similar to most other councils, is heavily subsidised by general rate revenue. And that's, you know, a well accepted course of action.
What is the average? It used to be about $5 per ratepayer. Is it more than that now? What? I guess it depends on the service.
Correct.
But, yeah.
Yeah, it certainly depends on the service and how much that service costs, how much the service is used. But I know in the local government game that, look, whether it's a rec centre, whether it's a swimming pool, the likes, they all run at deficits. And it's a case of how much they are subsidised by general rates. And I guess in terms of setting fees, well, the council then needs to determine, well, what is the appropriate fee to hopefully encourage use of those services. So, yeah, that's another sort of conundrum that council needs to turn to its mind to each year, but referencing the fact that the majority of our services or those that do have a user charge element attached to them are heavily subsidised by general rates. Then on the next slide, what I've done here is shown in percentage terms what the percentage movement up or down has been with those revenue streams over the last 5 years, and then compared to the forward projections over the next 5 years. So clearly, based on the modelling for the next 5 financial years, you'll see there's generally a consistent trend. That's based on the modelling assumptions contained in the long-term financial plan model. But looking back over the previous 5 years, you'll see there has been a bit of volatility in terms of that percentage movement. But quite often, that percentage movement is impacted by factors outside of our control. As I've noted in a couple of the bullet points to that slide. So, for example, with the green line, the revenue, the spike for 2020 with over a 50% increase in that revenue line was solely informed by the 171,000 reimbursement we got from SA Power Networks relating to street lighting cost reimbursement. So I just thought, yeah, that was to demonstrate the historic movement in those streams, and you'll see, I guess from a rates perspective, that has been fairly constant based on the rating discussions, the rating determination that's been made by council each year. Then relating to or turning to operating expenditure, again, the current state of play is a $32.22 million budget informed by employee costs, materials contracts and other depreciation and finance costs. And as you'll see from what I've got listed with the bullet points, heavily informed by particularly employee costs, which comprises 36% of our budget, 42% for materials contracts and other, depreciation of comprising 20%, and finance costs comprising 2%. Then again, thanks Tony, on the next slide, showing that trend data for expenditure. Again, looking at the previous 5-year historical trends compared to the modelling in the long-term financial plan, and you'll see the relative consistency therein. Bearing in mind, members, that the two key things from depreciation and finance cost perspective, they are heavily informed by a number of key factors. In terms of depreciation, any increases there will invariably be informed by the level of investment in new and upgraded assets each year. And conversely, with finance costs, that will be heavily impacted by the level of debt. So if debt was to reduce, then that would automatically be reducing our finance costs. If it was to increase, the opposite would apply. Then on the next graph, looking at the percentage movements historically over the last 5 years, you'll see a bit of volatility, particularly in relation to finance costs and depreciation, really for the sheer factors I've just touched on, in terms of with debt coming down in a particular year, the flow-on consequence will generally be a reduction in finance costs. Similarly with depreciation, where there's a spike leading to an increase in that depreciation, that is informed by the level of investment we have in new and upgraded assets. And with relation to depreciation, you'll see that in recent years that percentage increase has been particularly sizable, and that has been informed by a number of key iconic asset investments we've done, whether it be this building, the Link Road, Walker Place, Murray Street upgrades, etc. So just to demonstrate the impact that has on depreciation. Debt. I need to emphasise, as I've put as a highlight, it's not a dirty word. And also need to emphasise, as I've got in bold, it's only a dirty word so long as it is effectively utilised, planned and managed. So in saying that, members, what I'm essentially saying is if council is to go into considerable debt, and as you're aware, we've got a relatively comparatively high debt at the moment, that is not necessarily an issue, provided we've got a robust plan to manage that over coming years. Now, there's been, what I wanted to touch on, members, I've got a couple of slides relating to debt. I have had a conversation with the Local Government Finance Authority, who we have all our debt with. Members may recall that certainly when I started here in 2009, we had the flavour back then was locking in each year when you adopted your budget. That would have provide for new loan borrowings in that year. And what occurred for 4 years in a row was we locked in loans of $3 million at a fixed interest rate over the life of the loan. The life of those loans were for 15 years. And members, that was the rationale or reason for that was predominantly informed by our operating result at the time, because we had operating deficits in the order of $3 million. But what has occurred since 2010-11 is that we've transitioned completely away from fixed interest borrowings, and what we've done since then is essentially utilise what's pretty much operates as an overdraft facility with the Local Government Finance Authority. So what that means is, rather than locking in debt at a fixed interest through the cash advance debenture facility with the LGFA, we can pretty much have a overdraft facility that importantly can be repaid when cash flow permits. So the important thing, Mayor, in that regard is whenever we get quarterly rate payments in, we can use, and we've got favourable cash flow on a daily basis, we review where our cash position is, and if there's any surplus cash, that immediately goes off debt reduction. And that has been that approach since 2011 has dramatically reduced our interest bill each year. And I need to stress, we do monitor our cash position on a daily basis. So there has been a prudent approach in that regard. Cody, did you want to ask a question?
So with the fact that the variable interest rates are down at the moment, does that mean that we can adjust, like, would we be saving money by, for example, pouring all of our debt repayments into the fixed interest loans or that kind of thing? Like, does it make a difference in that sense?
Yes, what we have looked at from time to time, Mayor, is that with the fixed loans historically dating back to from 2007-8 to 2010-11, they are fixed for the life of those loans. So what happens with those loans is that we have fixed half-yearly principal and interest repayments. And what we have looked at every few years is, well, is there any benefit in actually repaying in full, paying out those fixed interest loans by utilising our overdraft facility, which is at a far lower interest rate. Now, in that context, members, there's a future, one of the upcoming slides will show that our fixed interest rate loans, the interest rate we're paying on them range from 4.99% to 7.88%. So we're way above current interest rates. But when we have looked at the option of using the overdraft facility to pay out those loans, it always comes back as not being viable because there's a sizable financial penalty for doing so. So yes, we do look at that option from time to time, but noting as well that those fixed interest loans, the first one that will be fully repaid will be in 2022-23, and the last one to be repaid will be in 2025-26. So in the next few years, they will be being paid off. However, what I did want to point out was that in our Treasury management policy, our policy position, and this policy was reviewed a couple of years ago independently, and it's also been endorsed by our Audit Committee, including our independent members. One of the underpinning policies or positions in that policy is essentially to not put all our eggs in one basket, so to speak, from a debt management perspective. So the policy position is that we have, from a fixed interest perspective, no less than 25% of our debt in fixed interest and no less than 30% with variable interest. Now, up until this financial year, we've been operating within those parameters, bearing in mind that in 2010-11, 100% of our debt was fixed. So since then, we've been reducing that percentage in fixed interest, increasing it in variable interest, and to the extent that now that the majority of our debts and our forecast debt as at 30 June is estimated to be under $4 million in fixed loans and about $21 million on the variable rate. Now, what that means is that we would be actually operating potentially 30 June outside of that policy threshold. However, until now, I've professionally haven't had any real concern with that, only for the sheer fact that if there didn't really seem to be too much financial sense in converting a chunk of our variable debt to fixed debt if the fixed interest rate is actually higher than the variable rate. However, what has recently transpired in speaking to the LGFA is they've advertised a fixed interest rate for a 5-year term in the order of 1.7 to 1.8%, which again immediately pricked my interest due to the fact that we're currently paying 2.05% on our variable debt. Recognising, as I've got in the slide, members, that 2.9 million of our debt attracts an interest rate of only 1.3%, and that came about solely from the fact that as a COVID-19 initiative from the LGFA, they told each council you can lock in 10% of debt. You can lock in at you can lock in for a 3-year term at 0.75% under the market rate. You can lock in 10% of what your operating revenue was in 2018-19. Now, for this council, that translates to $2.9 million. So it comes as no surprise, as soon as that was applicable, we locked in or converted 2.9 of our debt to that 1.3%. So that was a benefit to the sector, appreciated by the LGFA.
These other fixed interest loans that occurred pre-2010, they incur a financial penalty if they're paid out early. With the LGFA, with this fixed interest sort of opportunity, are they charging a financial penalty if you pay out early?
Yeah, a good point, Mayor. I think the attraction here for me is that what they were suggesting was that, as I touched on before, we've got in the order of over $20 million in variable interest. So what they were suggesting was we could convert a chunk of that to a fixed interest rate, lock it in for 5 years. What it then means at the end of that 5 years is up to council to determine, well, do you want to roll that over for a longer term, or so there's essentially no penalties attached to it, because all we'd really be doing was be converting part of that variable debt into a fixed interest, and it really just gives surety, a bit more surety with our finance costs moving forward. But the important thing is it's about at an interest rate, 0.25% interest rate less than what we're currently paying. So I saw that as being a good financial incentive.
Just take the question from Di.
And Paul, some of that's because the fixed interest that we've got at the moment were really long terms, weren't they? Where this is only 5 years for your fixed interest. But also, if interest rates suddenly start to jump and we've got all our money in variable, we're going to have left it too late, aren't we, to be able to get that low interest.
And I think I asked you earlier in the day, Paul, around would interest rates go down? Because you read different reports that they're going to go below zero, and that's probably focused on overseas. But your impression of interest rates in the next 5 years?
Well, Mayor, with the conversations I had with the sort of lending managers with the LGFA, they're certainly suggesting for the next couple of years, at least, interest rates won't materially move. They're certainly of the view that they won't come down anymore. They're of the view that pretty much the trough is where it is. So they were of the view that unless we were already looking to materially reduce our variable interest rate debt, which the long-term plan suggests that won't come down by any great extent over the next few years, they were suggesting, it would be advisable to lock in, and as Councillor Fraser rightly indicates, and this was also part of the reason why we didn't want to put all our eggs in one basket, because if you've got it all in variable debt, as Councillor Fraser rightly points out, if interest rates were to, for whatever reason, start to creep back up, well, as I've demonstrated in previous reports, council would then need to turn its mind to, well, do we need to lock in part of that debt if the likelihood of interest rates increasing further is on the cards? So
just about debt reduction, some comments around that.
yes, yep. Well, again, Mayor, as I touched on at the start, debt's, it's not a dirty word, but it's got to be managed properly. Now, it really comes back to, again, I would argue that council needs to operate within its financial policy thresholds, whether that be its liabilities ratio or the operating result. But from a debt perspective, what it boils down to is if you do have a high liabilities ratio, which is predominantly informed by the council's debt position, that immediately then flows on, well, what is the financial capacity to do major capital works? So, and look, without fear or favour, Mayor, I'd like to call it as it is, that I think we clearly recognise certainly with our liabilities ratio, it's on the higher end of the scale in the sector. But whilst on face value that might look not less than ideal, what also has to be taken into consideration is each council is different. Each council, in terms of maintaining its fixed asset base, is at different lives of its journeys. So what I mean in saying that is you appreciate with this building, we came to the end of its useful life. Council had to make a decision as to what it needed to do. Members who were on the previous councils will look back knowing that well, certainly Mayor, you were on council at the time, where council was challenged by the Audit Committee back in, I think, about 2012 to actually get its debts down to free up important borrowing capacity, which occurred because our ratio result of liabilities ratio result, I think back in about 2010 was in the order of what it is now, so possibly slightly lower, I think about 86%. We got that down to half that in 4 years. And the crucial thing was, if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have had the financial capacity to do projects the nature of this civic centre. So what I'm saying is there's no right or wrong answer with the liabilities ratio. It's really informed by the council's priorities at the time, and particularly a growth council versus for want of a better word, a stagnant council with no growth. So there's a lot of factors that need to be taken into consideration, but a key point is, again, if you have a high liabilities ratio, it does constrain the council's financial capacity to do new projects. And that's why I've always looked at if council wish to consider doing the next iconic project in, say, 4, 5, 6 years' time, whatever project that might be, the only way you'd be able to achieve it based on the current ratios is via debt reduction. And so that's what council ultimately sort of need to turn its mind to in terms of, well, does it wish to develop that war chest, or alternatively, does it wish to roll out certain iconic projects on a stage-by-stage basis each year? So they're the sort of conversations we'll have to have over coming months. Does that answer your question there?
Sort of, not quite, but yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to, I just did want to touch on that point in terms of the movement with the interest rates between fixed and variable, and what that potentially means and could look like for the council. But certainly here and now, I am advocating that council needs to turn its mind to, well, does it want to lock in part of its variable debt for 5 years at a considerably lower interest rate. So
just a question around recurrent expenditure, and just maybe I'll direct that to you, CEO, around your thoughts around recurrent and opportunities for savings there.
Thank you, through the chair. Yes, every year we look at the budget, not only in terms of capital new initiatives, but we look at the recurrent expenditure, we look at opportunities for savings, and it's been incremental. Technology has certainly enabled us to achieve some savings. Every dollar counts. More recently, the changes that we made in the property and the procurement space, with the sort of a splitting of that function and focusing on procurement and generating some sort of organisational improvements in procurement, I think we'll start to reap some rewards over the next 12 to 18 months. We're rethinking where we've had budgets previously. We've had, particularly in terms of capital projects, where we've achieved efficiencies, and within our scope of delegation, where savings has been achieved, we've made various decisions, right decisions, I think, at the time, to expand the scope of the service or to get better outcomes. Now what we're doing increasingly is saying, well, where there's a saving, let's pause and let's consider what are the consequences of that savings relative to what is, as Paul's been presenting the picture, of a 4 or 5 year period of deficits. The work we're doing in terms of benchmarking is also important in terms of increasing organisational awareness about performance and efficiencies. I'm hoping in the next month or so we'll be talking about the community scorecard, how we measure achieving the community scorecard. We're also formulating an internal corporate scorecard, which is about, again, increasing that whole of organisation awareness about measuring what we do and sort of striving for improvements and efficiency. So what that means really is that every dollar counts, and where I can achieve savings with the executive team we are, and because I want to bring that deficit not year 5, but year 3 or year 2 where possible. Although that's going to be difficult, but certainly bring it home earlier than 5 years.
Thank you, Henry. Back to you, Paul.
thank you, Mayor Karen. So just to close the loop on the debt, so just go back one slide, Tony, thanks. I've just outlined there on that slide, members, what our current forecast is for indicative debt as at 30 June 21 and how that is componentised between our fixed interest rate loans and the variable interest rate. Those, as I touched on before, the fixed interest rate loans will be paid off in full, as you can see from the table, by February 2026. And each year we're invariably paying off principal of about $900,000 to $1 million. So they'll be repaid within the next 4 to 5 years. Mayor, on the next slide, just wanted to touch point relative to the activities from an administration perspective that are currently underway to inform future discussions at workshops and special council meetings. Again, this sort of highlights all the different elements that form the jigsaw of our financials, whether it be the long-term financial plan update, asset management plan updates, again emphasising the alignment that has to be between the two. The administration is currently working its way through draft budget bids to be considered by council over coming months, whether that be capital or new initiative bids. Again, also looking to undertake our annual review of the strategic rating policy, which we obviously do every year, And that's importantly, a key element of that, again, will be a review of the Gallery separate rates. But we'll be looking, as we do each year, a holistic approach with our rating policy to make sure it's sort of is fair and equitable each year, which so that is an important process we go through. Henry's just touched on the savings and efficiencies review. That's an ongoing focus of our work. Then, members, I just wanted to finish before we get to any questions relative to, well, what does this all mean and what do I see as some of the sort of key messages, take-home messages for you. And it's important to recognise that being one of the fastest growing councils in the state, that as you realise, certainly I think from my perspective, the average ratepayer always recognises, oh, well, if you're a fast growing council, you'll be swimming in cash with all this new rates coming in. Unfortunately, what gets lost in translation in that discussion is the financial consequences of managing that growth and everything that comes with it. Because yes, there's new rates from new development areas, but also in those new development areas, as you will readily appreciate, there's assets that need to be maintained and depreciated, reserves that need to be maintained. So it's a double-edged sword in terms of, yes, there is new revenue, but there also does come considerable expenditure attached to it. Other factors I've listed there, council will need to sort of consider is the ongoing impact of COVID-19 for various ratepayers in our community. I do believe, members, the approach we've taken this financial year has been sector leading. Also, other considerations I've indicated there will be the potential impact of the local government changes to the Local Government Act. As we've previously reported, Mayor, I'm very much relieved that hardcore rate capping is sort of off the table, but nonetheless, the legislation still does prescribe, for example, or the proposed legislation that every 3 years we'll need to go through a level of independent scrutiny. What that looks like, I don't necessarily know, but I think one thing I'm certain of, that will be a sizable piece of work and administrative burden. Yet another thing from a compliance perspective that we'll need to do.
Sorry.
Yep.
Paul Kosh?
Yeah, just on that, so it's not a yearly review like
No,
it was
they
going to
changed
be.
it.
They actually changed it, thank
yeah.
goodness for that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, good to hear.
crazy stuff.
That's shocking.
Yes, it is.
Yes, safe to say, members, when we're looking at rate capping, that was sort of keeping me awake at night, thinking what the implications of that would look like. But the proposed legislation has been very much watered down in that regard, and that there'll be a rolling cycle every 3 years. The council will be subject to the scrutiny of I think it's the SCOSA they're looking at. So yes, I'd certainly take that option over annual rate capping any day of the week. Other factors I've just indicated there for members to consider is the potential future impact of boundary reform. Just to point out to members though, the only financial impact I've got in the long-term financial plan model is provision for a $250,000 expense in 21-22 for a boundary commission to do their investigation. The other factors I've just touched on there is potential exposure to interest rate risk, albeit when we've talked about that interest rates aren't looking to move in any huge hurry. And again, as you're aware, we're always keen to seek grant funding applications towards capital works, which is good, and certainly reduces our upfront commitment. But when we're seeking grant applications, we also need to be mindful, well, what's the whole of life cost associated with those projects? And last but not least, on the bullet point on that slide is, well, what future increase in general rate and revenue is the elected member body wishing to seek? Is it 3%? Is it 2%? 1.5%? That's hence why I've put those modelling scenarios in there for council to consider.
Just to clarify, the 3%, for example, is probably what you're advocating, I think. So that's a rate increase plus new growth. Yeah, so that's how we get the 3%. So it's not actually a 3% on top of everybody. It's 3% made up of those two things, those two components.
No,
No?
I'll just let Paul explain.
Yes. Yeah, just to be clear, again, well, I need to be clear, professionally, I'm not advocating any of the approaches. It's really for the elected member body to turn its mind to. But nonetheless, professionally, I would have thought, and sorry, just to go back a step to clarify, with those percentage increases, that's just for existing ratepayers. So growth is on top of that.
So if you got 2% growth and you had a 3% rate rise for existing ratepayers, it's 5% increase.
Yep.
The 5% increase in rate revenue by total revenue. Does that make sense? So existing ratepayers have got a 3%.
Yeah.
So that's why different scenarios are there. So there's still that, but growth is currently still slightly under 2% the last 12 months.
Yes, for 1920, it was marginally under, sorry, for 2021, marginally under 2%. But
at that point, it's been around about 2.
yes, yeah, historically for about last 5 years, averaged very close to 2%, if not slightly higher, based on the rating data we're looking at for 2021-22, because I periodically have touch points discussions with our rates officers and our planning staff, and because that growth is very much informed by the new residential land developments. And my understanding is Springwood, for example, has been going gangbusters in the last sort of 6 months. And so there will be a sizable take-up of new residential allotments for 21-22 from those new developments. And there's also been a component of urban infill through hammerhead allotments being created. So at this stage, I would suggest the growth rate for 21-22 is likely to be slightly higher than 2%. And that's what does particularly help in that regard, members, is the onboarding of commercial properties. So, for example, Mayor, we have the, I know in Gawler East, for example, we have the new ex-convenience. Mobile X, and
I noticed they put the petrol prices up to everybody else. Didn't take long. Sorry, just a quiet observation.
Yep. Yes, so I'm mindful, confident there should be a slightly higher growth rate than 2% based on current indications. But in terms of getting back to the percentage increase for existing ratepayers and what that might look like for 21-22, look, at the end of the day, I'd ultimately say that needs to be a council decision, but nonetheless, I guess if I was asked for my sort of professional opinion, Mayor, I would have thought the increase of 3% may not necessarily be terribly palatable, but certainly based on, as I demonstrated in the previous slide, what other councils are looking at is in the order of sort of 2% to 2.5%. So it's I would have thought a increase in the order of 2 to 2.5% potentially could be on the cards for consideration, but I do respectfully you point out that that is a decision for ultimately for the chamber.
And other things are informed, like a growth isn't just about rate revenue from new residents, it's also about the liability of those new areas. As you know, Councillor Kosh, you've always been very focused on, open space and the service level, for example, and the costs of Gawler East and over the long term and the millions of dollars, that modelling that was done. And so that all has to be factored in, doesn't it? Hang on, I'll get you, just so everyone can hear.
Just to clarify, the 3% I just assumed was we would go 2.5 and then growth would give us the other bit for 3. But that's you're saying that you said 3, but I assumed it was 2.5 plus the growth would give us 3. Yeah. Okay.
I'll go back to Paul, then to Councillor Fraser.
Yeah.
Do you want, I'll just might ask Councillor Fraser ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
The government first home build was not necessarily just for first home, but 25,000. Do you think that would make an increase to some of our newer areas, as in far as property development? Do you have any indication on that?
I think Ryan's got some information around that.
Oh, okay.
Ryan's got some intel on that. Thank you, Mr. Viney.
Yeah, through the chair. That has had a significant impact. The stimulus programs that have been rolled out both state and federally have, in my opinion, brought forward a lot of development, particularly in those new growth areas that perhaps was planned for the next year. It really has brought forward those developments. And I think, we reported last night in council that we're up about 100% on this time last year in terms of development applications. And that's a reflection of that increased demand and the increased stimulus that's been pumped into the economy. And I think Gawler and I suppose the northern suburbs more generally sits really in the sweet spot for that first homeowner buyer market. And that's exactly where that stimulus money is being targeted. So as Paul said, I think our growth will be a little bit higher than it has traditionally been, and for the next 12 months at least.
And so that then impacts on sport and recreation and the demands of our new community members who will have families who will want to use sport and recreation. And so that puts pressure on our desire to deliver projects such as Carbethan. And so those issues aren't going to go away, they'll grow, because once the families come, they're going to want all these facilities, aren't they? So, interesting. Always a challenge. Paul, back to you. Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Back to you, Councillor Kosh. Sorry.
Just looking on the fact that a lot of that development has come forward, that meaning subsequent years that will drop down? Have we modelled that, or?
It's hard to know. But
Yeah, hard to know.
Mr. Viney?
Look, I think that's hard to model at this stage. I think that a conservative approach would be that it has brought forward development that has otherwise in the wings. I think the longer term impacts of COVID-19 are yet to be fully realised and particularly in terms of migration to the state and population growth in terms of numbers. So I think, historically we've relied heavily on people, migrants moving into the state and helping to drive population growth. I think population growth in the long term is something that may well be impacted by COVID, but, there are a lot of variables. Less people are leaving as well, but I think our net migration was greater. So.
Yeah, I think it was. Wasn't all that. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of those numbers are based around the eastern states, which survive on huge amounts of immigration, which has stopped. But we haven't really. We've had a net exodus, but not much, so it hasn't really changed for us from a immigration point of view.
We also have the people that are overseas coming back home to live too, so they're going to be looking for somewhere to live as well. So.
That's happened, it's been an interesting influx of highly skilled people that are bringing in lots of expertise into South Australia. It's quite an interesting space at the moment. Sorry. I'll go back to Mr Hallwood then. Paul? Oh, yeah, all good?
Thank you, Mayor Karen. With this last slide with key messages, I think one of the one of the closing points I wanted to touch on was the last bullet point I've got on that slide, because we've just talked about in terms of, well, what a 21-22 rate increase may look like, but that's just part of the equation, in that the members will need to turn their mind to, well, not only what percentage increase they may wish to consider, but then all else being equal with the budget, if you have a lower rate increase, well then what consequence does that have on our new loan borrowings for 21-22, assuming the same level of expenditure. So that's why I always reference, Mayor, there needs to be an appropriate mix of what I call, obviously, revenue from existing ratepayers, but also revenue from future ratepayers via loan borrowings. What's the appropriate mix? Because if you have a lower general rate increase, then what is going to be the consequences, not only on that budget, but future budgets? Because again, as I said at the start, Council needs to not consider this budget in isolation, needs to consider it in the longer term. So there are a myriad of questions that need to be considered in that regard, but also I don't want it to be seen necessarily as just solely relying on what that general rate revenue discussion is, because as Henry rightly touched on, we need to determine, well, what's our operating expenditure going to look like? Is there any areas we can save or make efficiencies? What's our capital expenditure program going to look like? What's our financial capacity to do that? What is the longer term implications of those capital investments? So there is a sizable number of questions that go in the melting pot for Council to consider, and I'm sort of hoping, Mayor, that with 3 minutes to go, I've been able to hopefully sort of, as I put in the slide at the start, this is very much a jigsaw of local government finances. There's a whole host of elements that comprise putting that jigsaw together, whether it's looking at expenditure, looking at debt, looking at rates, and it's appropriate that they all get looked at ultimately, so that when we come to the workshops and the special council meetings, I'm hoping elected members can reach their decisions from an informed position, which obviously we as an administration are here to help you with. And I certainly hope the presentation tonight has been beneficial in that regard, bearing in mind with that last slide, Mayor, where to from here. Members will be hopefully by now familiar with the approach we use, that starting with this first workshop tonight, very much setting the overarching scene, then followed by a second workshop and third workshop, which will then turn our minds to the recurrent budget and capital and new initiative budget bids.
Have these dates been put, is there a hold in our diaries?
Yes.
There is a hold that
Yes.
we can see. I mean, it's not, we need to confirm, but just so we're aware.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, they're in everyone's
Good,
diaries.
good.
Members, it's also important to note the Audit Committee will be again playing an important role, as they should. They'll have a preliminary review of the budget, such that can then inform discussion at the special council meeting scheduled for the 6th of April. But importantly, then there'll be a further opportunity for the Audit Committee to revisit the budget at a later juncture. And as you're aware, that process also leading up to budget adoption includes that 3-week public consultation process, culminating in ideally adopting the budget on the 6th of July. So Mayor, this is very much the start of the journey that we go through each year, but happy to answer any questions members might have.
Firstly, before I open it up for questions, we have had quite a number of questions all the way through, so thank you for being so actively engaged tonight, elected members. Thank you for a really thorough presentation. It's set the scene for the next few months. It is exciting to be making decisions around budgets. It's the biggest decision council makes, or one of the biggest decisions, and it is an important process to be a part of. So thank you, Paul, and your team for your work, and the executive team for all your work with deciding what's in and what's out, and who gets what and what we get. So it's all good fun. Any questions? Cody?
So in terms of the question of increasing level of community involvement in the budget, I've been talking about the idea of this participatory budgeting. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on it at this point.
Yes, and Councillor Davies, certainly, aware of your interest in that space. I know there have been, I think in Melbourne, going back a few years, and you can clarify if this is what you're wishing council to consider, but I know the extent a few large metropolitan councils have done interstate is been in a position where, in terms of getting community engagement, they have gone as far as promoting the fact that, well, this is our draft budget, and you can actually go online and suggest, well, what projects you want to put in, and put a dollar value attached to it, and it will actually calculate how that may look like. But that, I would respectfully suggest, we're nowhere near being in a position to do that, and that would come at a considerable cost to develop any sort of software that would provide for that. But yes, I certainly will be turning my mind to it leading up to the consultation period, relative to whether there's any way that we can improve the consultation, particularly on the budget, because as we touched on earlier, invariably there's never generally been a very high take-up, irrespective of anything we do to try and encourage submissions. So I certainly welcome any ideas in that space, but we'll be turning our mind to it.
I think a more visual display of a draft budget is a good idea, of pictures, and just give that visual display of, well, these are some of the projects we're considering. These are the required, this is how much we can't touch because it's statutory requirements, otherwise we'll be outside our legal framework. Just what that might look like, I'm not sure, but I think the 2-page spread in the bunyip or some visuals via the socials is a good idea. More and more people using social media and using visuals in a much more effective way. That can sometimes be quite useful rather than just a list. Yeah, I think what we did last year was really good in that we put those sheets up and people could contribute under themes of what they found, as a priority. And I know you said that we haven't got the resource to do that this year, but maybe next year we could look at something like that, because I thought that worked quite well.
So, Mayor, what I guess when I was saying that, what I was meaning was that we're not in a position to do that as a pre-budget consultation.
Yeah.
Because we did that last year about early January.
Yeah.
However, that's not to say that we couldn't do that as part of our normal 3-week consultation.
Yeah.
So if we believe that that's going to get better engagement, and look, I would tend to suggest, as you've sort of touched on, we've got to, in terms of consultation documents, yes, we need to put the full budget document out for consultation, but that is a heavy read.
It is.
And I'll openly admit that. So we need to target the message, tailor it to what's going to resonate with residents to get that buy-in. And whether it's a 2 or 3 page snappy promo with pictures, yeah, I'm not sure, but increasingly need to steer away from heavy documents that I appreciate. A lot of people will say, well, I haven't got time to read that. I want to know, well, what's the high points? What's going to be the take-home message for me?
Yeah.
What's impacts is it going to be on my hip pocket, so to speak? But
So yeah, just following up on the budgeting. So I was, there's sort of a few ways that it's been done differently in different countries and that sort of thing. But, some people do something like, for example, you set aside like $10,000 and say what this is going to be spent on with, is going to be decided by the community, like direct, vote kind of, within the criteria of what's an acceptable use of it. But, it's the sort of thing where you'd be like, oh, should we have, new park benches here, or should we have this here, or should we invest in this, playground for a new thing? And you get people directly able to, say something. It doesn't necessarily mean the whole budget is going to be, people directly deciding, like we still, are doing that, but it's getting people involved in the process in a way that they feel like this isn't the council's budget, this is my budget, like we did something, so just, more ideas.
Mayor, yes, definitely. But I think in that regard, though, Councillor Davies, that pre-budget engagement we did last year, I thought that worked. I think it's collectively recognised worked pretty well, because what that did in terms of what you touched on then was, with those interactive posters, it meant, well, people could say, well, I want council to focus on this because this is, whether it's animal management or parks and reserves. So people could readily provide feedback without having to put too much thought and effort into it. And invariably, I often find, being a resident of the district myself, that people will tell me, well, council should be spending more money on this, and you'll all get those same comments. And so that may be a similar approach we could do this year, Mayor and members, that during the consultation period.
Yeah. I know at the Eltley Centre. Feral cats. We'll wait for that bylaw. We'll wait for the bylaw and let's hope the Dog and Cat Management Board actually, lift their game, frankly, which is always a tricky one. I know at the Elderly Centre last year, they really loved being part of that, consultative process. And they put a lot of ticks. They took a lot of time to consider. Were really interested, because most of those people live in Gawler, and so they really got engaged in that. Down in the admin centre in the foyer, there were lots of ticks on various things. Yeah, so depending on which centre had, and the demographic, the ticks would change, which is fine. But yeah, so that I thought that was quite an interesting process, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? No? Thank you. Let's call this to a close. Thanks everyone who might be listening. We're going to wrap this up. Good evening, everyone.